Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Mondays with Mundy, and that's me, Jim Mundy, the historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation. I'm recording this episode on Veterans Day, November the 11th, 2022. And why not? It's a very appropriate day in the League's history because, after all, the League was organized in December of 1862 as a patriotic social society whose purpose was to suppress the rebellion. And to do that, you need soldiers. And so during the war, the League raised 20,000 soldiers, that is 20 regiments, 1,000 soldiers each. There were 11 black regiments known as the United States Colored Troops, and there were 9 white regiments known as the Union League regiments, 1 through 9. So on Broad Street, in front of the League House, the 1865 League House, stand 2 bronze sculptures representing Civil War soldiers, 1 infantry, 1 artillery, and they've got a wonderful story. So why don't we look into it? So let me do my screen sharing. All right, that, and then I've got to do that, and then I go up here, do that, I do that. Hot diggity dogs. Okay, everybody, here we go. The Union League's silent sentinels. So here's the League House, early 21st century. And if you look at the bottom left and right-hand corners, you'll see the 2 bronze sculptures to which I referred. So on the left-hand corner, we have the Spirit of 61 by Henry Kirke Bush-Brown. And on the right-hand corner, we have the Washington Grays Artillery Corps, done by Joseph Wilson. So let's get into their stories. Now you can see why I call them silent sentinels. So let's talk a bit about where they came from. And of course, Philadelphia has a rich military history because it goes back into the 18th century and the Revolutionary War and things like that. And so there were many militia units and military regiments that were organized going back into the 18th century. But at the beginning of the Civil War, which was, everybody, April the 12th, 1861, there were numerous military or militia units in the Philadelphia region using the designation of the Grays. All right. The 19th century history of some of the units can be traced back to the War of 1812, when the Philadelphia Regiment of Artillery was mustered into federal service in August of 1814. Right? After the war, the regiment was subsequently reorganized in 1822, 1828, and finally, on April 25th of 1861, designated as the 1st Regiment Infantry Gray Reserves. So it is now an infantry unit, and that's the one on the left. Okay, right, got it? All right. So the 1st Regiment was one of the major components of the Philadelphia military culture organizations, if you will. And one of its major designations was also, previous days, as the Washington Grays Artillery Corps. And so the Artillery Corps is represented by the sculpture on the right-hand side. And after the war, this Washington Grays Artillery Corps continued under the command reorganization, as always happens in military organizations. And it did retain some of its individuality. That is, it managed to maintain its presence, even within the larger military scheme of things within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so it was one of the most prominent military, social, and politically active organizations in the city through the mid-20th century. So the 1st Regiment Infantry, which included the Artillery Corps, all right, exists today as the 103rd Engineer Battalion, Pennsylvania National Guard, also known as the Dandy First. Wonderful nickname, isn't it? And it is the oldest command structure within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So there you go. Got it? Okay, hope that made sense. So let's move on. Now, sculptures have to come from somewhere. They just don't appear out of thin air. And so both of our bronzes were cast and created at what was known as, in Philadelphia, the Bureau Brothers Foundry. Now, the Bureau Brothers actually were French. We had Edouard and Achille, what you would pronounce the name as Bureau, not Bureau, which we would anglicize in Philadelphia. And the Bureau Foundry had 2 locations, 21st and Allegheny, and then 23rd in Westmoreland, but both in that Allegheny West neighborhood, I think, as we would call it today. This is what the building looks like today. It still exists, believe it or not. And this is what the interior looked, as you can see, and that's when it was at Allegheny Avenue. Now, from there, it didn't move to Westmoreland until, 1894. And then it looks like this today. All right, so the foundry itself stayed in business until roughly 1934, 1938. And then it was used for many things, including piano storage, which is what we see here today. But at least you get the idea what the building looked like. And that's what I wanted to convey. So that's where the sculptures came from. And this is where they would go. So this is the Broad Street building, as we call today, from 1908. As you can see, there's nothing there. At least I wanted to show you what it did look like without them, because now we know what it looks like with one. This is the oldest photograph that I could find that shows the Spirit of 61 in front of the League House, and you can see it along the left-hand side of the photograph, right? You can see so look under the flags, and you'll see him there with the musket over his right shoulder. And this was a World War I Liberty Bond drive, so it's 1918. And again, as I say, it was the oldest one that I could find. But at least it gives you an idea what it looked like. But here's another one from 1940 that gives you even a better idea, perhaps, and just how it stands there so prominently on the front apron of the building itself. So good stuff there. Now, what you can also tell is that, which we could not tell from previous photograph, is that the sculpture is raked. That is, it is on an angle, okay, to make it look as if he's walking uphill almost, but it gives more, I think, a sense of motion to the sculpture itself. And this was actually the first Civil War sculpture that represented a soldier in motion itself, believe it or not, in full military gear. So that's 1940. So it's pre-World War I. And then here we have May of 1962, when the League celebrated its centennial with President Dwight Eisenhower as the guest of honor. And if you look right on Broad Street along the curb line there, you'll see three gentlemen standing there, and President Eisenhower is on the right-hand side. So, but if you look to the upper right-hand corner, there is the Spirit of 61 still guarding the front of the house in its own silent way. So now, this sculpture was commissioned by the 1st Regiment Infantry in 1911 to commemorate its 50th anniversary. That is its 50th Civil War anniversary. And it was eventually meant to be located in Fairmount Park, but that never happened. So after the sculpture was completed by the Bureau brothers, it was placed in front of the League House temporarily until a permanent place was found, which never was. And so finally, the 1st Regiment Infantry, which still exists today, and is the owner, deeded ownership of the sculpture to the Union League of Philadelphia, which now owns it to this day. Okay. And as you can see by looking at the right-hand side of the photograph, there's nothing else there yet, but that's going to change. But in the meantime, what happens to bronze sculptures when they get exposed to all kinds of weather, especially acid rain and things like that, because there's all kinds of chemicals in the air, and this is what happens. So this is the sculpture as it looked in 1987, before it was conserved. And you can see all that green stuff, copper sulfates, that are in the air, and that turns the bronze into that greenish color, and that's what happens there. Some close-ups. My, oh my. And then after conservation. Now, Tamsin Fuller did the conservation on this originally, the good old-fashioned way. Lots of wool rubbing and handwork, and that's how she did it. So, and it just looks magnificent. And so just, in the conservation process, rather, I should say, forgive me, after you scrub all the copper sulfates off and you have a smooth surface, you then heat it to make sure there's no moisture in the bronze itself. You would then give it a microcrystalline layer of wax, because you heat the sculpture, so the wax is very thin. It covers the whole sculpture. And then after that sets, you use a carnauba wax, which is a little thicker, but which you can buff, because buffing, believe it or not, actually keeps air particulates from actually being absorbed into the bronze itself. So it's all good stuff there. So that's what the Spirit 61 looks like today. And it's even so good that you can actually see the sculptor's signature on the left-hand side of the base. So, but it's not the only one we have out front, right? We have two. And this is actually the older of the two sculptures. This one was commissioned by a group of officers from the old Washington Gray Artillery Corps. And during the war, 17 of the artillery corps officers were killed in action. So the idea was to memorialize them in some form or another. And what we have here then is what that form is. So pretend the sculpture doesn't exist at the top. So the bottom granite part was the original sculpture that was created, and you can see, in 1872. And it was placed at Broad and Gerrard Streets. And it stood there for many, many years, actually until 1898, when they were putting trolley lines in on Broad Street, and they needed more room. And so the sculpture was picked up and packed off to Washington Square, right in the south, with the old Southeast Square, right in the old city, in the old part of the city itself. And it stood there until 1954, when they were going to install a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And so once again, it got picked up and packed off, this time to the Lemon Hill neighborhood in Fairmount Park, right? Sedgley, Gerrard, and that neck of the woods. And it stood there until 1991, when it was moved to the Union League's front apron. So all good stuff. As you can see, though, over the years, things weren't kind to it, whether it was local folks or just the weather itself. So you can see that the pom-pom, as we call it, was missing from the top of its hat. The scabbard was missing, and so were medallions on the granite base itself. So let's see what eventually happened. Now, this is what it looked like in Washington Square. You can see that's the Curtis building behind it. Magnificent building and a magnificent sculpture. Look at that. And then here we have it at Lemon Hill. But as you can see, it too has suffered from years of exposure to all kinds of weather and acid rain and things like that, including various forms of vandalism. So now, before it was moved to the League House, the front apron, it too had to be conserved. And there's Tamsin Fuller on the left-hand side. And this is at the George Young Company warehouse at 20th and Oregon. And they were the riggers who moved it. And so Tamsin's going to clean it. And on the right-hand side, you can see John Phillips, who had his own foundry in Germantown. The foundry is still there. John regretfully died a few years ago. And John was a sculptor in his own right. So John knew how to make and cast pieces. And so he made the pom-pom, as you will, and you can see it in the left-hand side. He also cast a new bayonet for the musket and a new scabbard for the soldiers' left side. So that's Tamsin Fuller on the left and John Phillips on the right. And this is moving day. So here's the actual base that was moved in front of the Lake House, all done, and all the work was prepared by, again, the Young Regan Company. You can see that. Now think of this as a piece of architecture. So you have a base, then you have a column or the shaft, right? And then you have a capital going on top. So here we have the base, we have the capital, if you will, being placed on top, and that's part of the original component to it. You can see how the cannons are part of the decorative process there. And then here we have the capital going on top, and it is on top of this that the sculpture would be placed. And there's the sculpture all cleaned up by Tamsin, being hoisted through the air, slowly lowered onto the top of the Capitol. And as you see on the right-hand side, it's resting there very comfortably. And once you clean a sculpture, you want to keep cleaning them. And why not? Because you don't want all that work to go to waste. And so we have a wonderful conservator named Doug Martinson, who actually teaches at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts on the north side of Broad Street. And Doug has been doing this now for about, oh my gosh, 15, 20 years for us, I guess, because once you start, you can't stop. And so every 2 to 4 years, we have these sculptures cleaned. Now, this is a good example of, you can see the pom-pom is there. You can see that the bayonet is there and the scabbard, and also the medallion on the granite column, if you will. So that bright, shiny granite medallion actually says WGAC, Washington Grays Artillery Corps. And that was added just for this. And then what happens to the sculptures once they're on display? Now, since the Phillies they made it to the World Series, and they didn't quite come as close as we would have liked, but this is the 2008 World Series celebration on South Broad Street. And just look at everybody mobbing Broad Street, and the sculptures are there. They survived. So I thought that was a nice way to kind of connect the past to the present through baseball. And we have here a very modern contemporary photograph of the front of the Broad Street building showing our two silent sentinels on the left and the right. So that's our story for Veterans Day 2022. I hope you enjoyed it. So next time you walk by the Broad Street building or anywhere on Broad Street itself, stop down, actually slow down, stop, and take a look at the sculptures. They really deserve your attention. So I would encourage you to do that. So that wraps up our episode. So once again, I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll watch some more, because there will be, I guarantee it. So take care, everybody, and we'll see you later. Bye now.